Silence is often mistaken for weakness, but psychology tells a very different story. A story that challenges everything we think we know about power, emotion, and human connection. The quietest response can sometimes carry the deepest emotional weight, especially when it comes from an empath who has finally stopped fighting for what they never should have had to fight for in the first place. Most people expect emotional pain to be loud, dramatic, and impossible to ignore. They expect arguments that fill rooms with tension, tears that cannot be hidden, long conversations that stretch into the night, or desperate attempts to fix what has been broken. That is why so many people become confused when an empath suddenly stops talking, when the person who once gave so freely of their words and emotions becomes still and silent. One day they are patient, understanding, and willing to work through every problem, their kindness seemingly without limit. Then, without warning, they become calm, distant, and almost impossible to reach, as if a door has closed that was never meant to be opened again. Many assume the silence is meant to punish someone, a form of emotional retaliation designed to make others feel the weight of their absence. But the truth is far more complex, far more nuanced than that simple interpretation. An empath rarely becomes quiet because they run out of words, because their vocabulary has been exhausted. They become quiet because they finally realize that words alone cannot create understanding where there is no willingness to listen, where the ears are open but the heart is closed. Long before the silence appears, there has usually been a long period of emotional effort that no one else noticed, a period of invisible labor that went unacknowledged and unappreciated. They explain their feelings with patience and clarity, hoping that better communication would bridge the gap. They forgave mistakes that others would have held against them, extending grace that was not earned. They gave second chances and third chances, and sometimes far more than that, believing that everyone deserves an opportunity to grow. They tried to see every situation from another person's point of view, bending their perspective to accommodate someone else's reality. They carried emotional burdens that were never theirs to carry, absorbing stress and pain that belonged to others. Yet, one hidden fact about empaths is that their greatest strength can slowly become their greatest source of emotional exhaustion, because the very sensitivity that allows them to connect so deeply also makes them vulnerable to the weight of the world. Modern psychology suggests that people with high levels of empathy often absorb emotional stress more deeply than others, making repeated disappointment much harder to recover from, because each disappointment leaves a mark that does not fully heal. The silence that follows is not sudden at all, not a spontaneous decision made in a moment of frustration. It is the final chapter of a story that has been unfolding quietly for a very long time. A story that was being written long before anyone noticed the ending was approaching. In this video, you will discover what is really happening inside the mind of an empath when they stop explaining themselves, why endless understanding can eventually turn into emotional withdrawal, how repeated emotional wounds slowly change the brain's expectations, why their silence is often misunderstood by friends, partners, and family, and why this quiet phase usually marks a powerful psychological transformation instead of emotional defeat. You will also learn why many people realize the true meaning of an empath's silence only after it is too late, and why rebuilding trust after this point becomes far more difficult than most expect, because the foundation has been eroded beyond repair. The final part of this journey reveals one of the least understood psychological shifts in highly empathetic people, a transformation that is invisible to the outside world but changes everything within. It may completely change the way you interpret silence in your own relationships, revealing its hidden meaning and its unexpected power. Stay with us until the very end, because every section connects to the next, revealing a deeper layer of this emotional process that few people ever recognize, a truth that can transform how you understand yourself and others. Welcome to the channel where we explore the hidden patterns of human psychology, relationships, and personal growth. If you enjoy thoughtful content that helps you understand yourself and others on a deeper level, subscribe now and join us for the journey. Empathy is often described as the ability to understand another person's feelings, to recognize their emotional state and respond with compassion. But real empathy goes much deeper than simply recognizing that someone is happy, sad, or angry, than identifying the surface emotion. It is the ability to emotionally connect with another person's experience while still knowing where their emotions end and your own begin, maintaining a clear boundary between self and other. This is what psychologists call healthy empathy, a balanced form of connection that allows for deep understanding without losing oneself in the process. A person with healthy empathy can care deeply, offer support, and remain emotionally available without losing themselves in someone else's pain, without sacrificing their own well-being for the sake of another. They can comfort a friend after a difficult day, listening with full attention and offering genuine concern. They can feel genuine concern, moved by the suffering of others. And they can still return home carrying their own emotional balance, their own sense of self intact. This form of empathy creates strong relationships because it combines kindness with healthy emotional boundaries, because it allows for connection without enmeshment. But not everyone experiences empathy this way. Not everyone maintains that clear boundary between self and other. Some people move beyond healthy empathy into emotional absorption, a state where the boundary between self and other becomes blurred or disappears entirely. Instead of simply understanding another person's emotions, they begin to absorb them as if those emotions belong to them, as if the pain of others has become their own. A tense room suddenly makes them anxious, their body responding to the stress before their mind has even processed what is happening. A loved one's sadness feels like their own sadness, indistinguishable from their own feelings. Someone else's anger stays with them long after the conversation has ended, lingering like a shadow that will not fade. They may spend hours thinking about another person's problems, even when they cannot do anything to solve them, their mind consumed by concerns that are not theirs. Their emotional world slowly becomes filled with feelings that were never truly theirs to carry, a burden that grows heavier with each interaction. Then there is hyperempathy, a state where emotional sensitivity becomes so intense that it starts affecting daily life, interfering with the ability to function normally. People with hyperempathy often notice tiny emotional signals that others completely miss, details that are invisible to the average observer. A slight change in someone's voice, a forced smile that hides disappointment, a pause before an answer, a different tone in a simple text message. These subtle cues become loud signals that demand attention. These details seem invisible to most people, easily overlooked in the flow of conversation. Yet an empath's mind immediately begins searching for meaning, trying to decode the hidden message beneath the surface. Sometimes those observations are accurate, providing genuine insight into the emotional state of others. But sometimes they create unnecessary worry, because the empath assumes responsibility for emotions that may have nothing to do with them, because they take on burdens that were never theirs to carry. This constant emotional awareness can become mentally exhausting, because the brain rarely gets a chance to rest, because there is no off switch for the sensitivity. Even during peaceful moments, it keeps scanning the emotional environment for signs that someone may be struggling, always alert to the possibility of pain. Many empaths do not even realize they are doing this because it feels completely natural to them, as natural as breathing. They walk into a room and instantly notice who seems uncomfortable, who is pretending to be happy, who feels ignored, or who is hiding frustration behind polite conversation. They see the tension that others miss, the hidden dynamics that shape the group. While other people focus on words, on the content of the conversation, empaths often focus on expressions, body language, silence, and emotional energy, the invisible language that speaks louder than words. Their attention naturally moves toward emotional details before logical facts, because emotions are the language they speak most fluently. This ability allows them to become wonderful listeners, supportive friends, caring partners, and trusted family members, because people often feel understood without needing to explain every feeling, because the empath seems to know what they are feeling before they say it. Yet this same strength quietly places an invisible weight on their shoulders, a burden that grows heavier with every interaction. Every emotional burden they notice becomes another burden they feel tempted to carry, another weight added to their load. They often become the person everyone turns to during difficult times because they rarely judge and almost always try to understand, because they offer a safe harbor in the storm. Over time, they begin solving problems that were never theirs to solve, taking on responsibilities that belong to others. They calm arguments they did not create, stepping into conflict to restore peace. They comfort people who may never ask how they themselves are feeling, giving endlessly without receiving in return. Harmony becomes more important than personal comfort, because conflict feels unbearable. They would rather sacrifice their own peace than watch someone else remain upset, because their own peace is negotiable while others' peace is a priority. This is one of the hidden reasons why many empaths appear so calm, why they seem unruffled even in the midst of chaos. Their calmness is not proof that everything is fine, not evidence that they are unaffected. It is often the result of years spent managing emotions quietly instead of expressing them openly, years of absorbing and processing rather than reacting and releasing. While the outside remains peaceful, a calm surface that others take for granted, the inside can feel incredibly busy, a whirlwind of thoughts and feelings that never cease. Every conversation is replayed, every word examined for hidden meaning. Every facial expression is analyzed, every gesture decoded. Every disagreement is examined from multiple angles, every perspective considered. They ask themselves whether they misunderstood someone, whether they could have responded differently, or whether they accidentally hurt another person's feelings, their mind always searching for the truth. This deep emotional processing continues long after everyone else has moved on, long after others have forgotten the conversation entirely. That is why silence from an empath should never be mistaken for emotional emptiness, for a lack of feeling. It often means the opposite, a sign of fullness rather than void. The mind is working overtime while the mouth says very little, because there is so much to process that words cannot keep up. They stay calm because they are trying to protect the relationship before protecting themselves, because the relationship has always come first. Long before silence arrives, they spend countless moments preventing conflict from growing, like a gardener tending to plants before they wither. They choose careful words, measuring each one for its potential impact. They avoid unnecessary arguments, letting small grievances pass. They forgive small mistakes, extending grace that is not always returned. They overlook behaviors that quietly hurt them because they believe understanding is more valuable than winning, because they value the relationship more than being right. Their silence does not begin on the day they feel hurt, on the day of the betrayal. It begins after they have spent a very long time trying to stop the hurt from happening at all, after they have exhausted every possible strategy. Because of this mindset, empaths rarely leave after the first disappointment, after the first sign of trouble. While another person may recognize an unhealthy pattern early and step away, an empath often pauses and searches for another explanation, another reason to stay. Maybe that harsh comment came from stress, a momentary lapse that does not reflect the person's true self. Maybe they are overwhelmed with work, their capacity stretched too thin. Maybe childhood experiences made it difficult for them to communicate, deep wounds that have not yet healed. Maybe next week will be different. Maybe things will improve with time. Instead of judging actions immediately, they search for hidden reasons behind those actions, for the story that explains the behavior. Their natural curiosity about human emotions makes them excellent at understanding difficult people, because they can see the pain behind the anger and the fear behind the cruelty. But it also makes them vulnerable to staying in painful situations far longer than they should, because they always believe there is hope for change. Every disappointment becomes another opportunity to practice patience, another chance to prove their commitment. Every broken promise becomes another chance to believe things will improve, another opportunity to trust. They do not ignore reality because they enjoy suffering, because they are masochists who seek pain. They ignore warning signs because they genuinely believe people are capable of growth, because they have seen transformation and believe it is possible for everyone. Hope becomes stronger than evidence, stronger than experience, stronger than the repeated disappointments that should have taught them otherwise. This pattern is supported by several psychological tendencies that explain why empaths stay so long. One is emotional investment, the principle that the more time, care, and emotional energy people invest in a relationship, the harder it becomes to walk away. Leaving feels like abandoning everything they have already sacrificed, like losing not just the person, but the years of effort they invested. Another factor is optimism bias, the natural tendency to expect positive outcomes even when repeated experiences suggest otherwise, the human capacity for hope that defies all evidence. The empath convinces themselves that tomorrow may finally be the day things improve, that next week will be different, that next month will bring change. They continue offering kindness because they remember moments when the other person showed love, even if those moments become increasingly rare, even if they are just memories of a past that no longer exists. Then there is compassion fatigue, a phenomenon that sneaks up slowly and is difficult to recognize. At first, compassion feels limitless, an endless well of care that can never run dry. Supporting another person brings meaning and purpose, fills the empath with a sense of value. But over time, Constantly caring without receiving emotional support in return slowly drains emotional resources, like a battery that is never recharged. The empath still wants to help, still feels the pull of compassion. Yet every conversation requires more effort than before. Every interaction takes more out of them. Their emotional energy begins running low, but they keep giving because stopping feels selfish, because they have been conditioned to believe that their needs come last. This is where understanding quietly transforms into a trap, a prison of their own making. The more they understand another person's pain, the easier it becomes to excuse behavior that repeatedly hurts them, because they can always find a reason to forgive. They become experts at explaining why someone acts the way they do, constructing elaborate theories that justify the behavior. Yet they rarely stop to ask whether those explanations actually change anything, whether understanding the reason makes the pain any less real. Understanding another person's struggles is valuable, a gift that can heal and transform. But understanding should never become permission for endless emotional neglect, for the erosion of the empath's own well-being. A reason is not the same as an excuse, no matter how compelling it may seem. Still, many empaths confuse these two ideas because their compassion encourages them to focus on why someone behaves poorly, instead of recognizing the damage those behaviors continue causing, because they see the person behind the pain rather than the pain itself. Every excuse delays an important decision, postponing the moment of reckoning. Every second chance extends emotional exhaustion, prolonging the suffering. Every hopeful thought pushes personal needs further into the background, making them smaller and smaller until they disappear entirely. Eventually, even the deepest well of understanding begins to run dry, the water finally running out. From the outside, people often believe an empath changes overnight, that the transformation is sudden and inexplicable. They say the empath suddenly became distant, suddenly stopped calling, suddenly lost interest, or suddenly became quiet, as if a switch was flipped. But emotional change almost never happens suddenly, almost never arrives without warning. It happens slowly, almost invisibly, through emotional accumulation that builds over time. A simple way to understand this process is to picture a glass sitting beneath a dripping faucet, a small container slowly filling with drops. One drop falls into the glass, a single moment of disappointment. Nothing happens. The glass remains unchanged. Another drop follows, another disappointment. Still, nothing changes. The glass appears stable. Hundreds of drops continue filling the glass while it still appears perfectly stable, while the water level rises but remains hidden from view. Then, one final drop lands and the water spills over the edge, the glass overflowing. Anyone watching only the final moment might blame that last drop, the final event, for the overflow. But the overflow was never caused by one drop alone, by the final moment. It was caused by everything that came before it, by the accumulation of countless smaller moments that were never addressed. Emotional pain works the same way, a slow accumulation of hurt that eventually becomes unbearable. Every disappointment adds another drop, another layer of pain. Every broken promise adds another drop, another crack in the foundation of trust. Every ignored feeling, every forgotten apology, every lonely night, every one-sided effort, every conversation where their emotions were dismissed quietly raises the emotional level inside, slowly filling the glass. The empath may smile, continue helping, and keep believing because the glass has not overflowed yet, because the pain has not yet reached the breaking point. But, inside, emotional pressure continues building, the water rising higher and higher. Trust weakens one experience at a time rather than disappearing all at once, each betrayal adding to the erosion. Feeling emotionally invisible becomes one of the deepest wounds, because the empath gives so much attention to others while quietly wondering why nobody notices their own pain, why their suffering goes unrecognized. They listen carefully but rarely feel equally heard, their own words falling on deaf ears. They remember important details about everyone else's life while their own emotional struggles receive little attention, their needs forgotten in the rush to meet the needs of others. Relationships slowly become unbalanced, tipping further and further until they are no longer sustainable. One person receives comfort while the other provides it, creating a hierarchy of care. One person expresses frustration while the empath patiently understands, their patience taken for granted. One person is allowed to make mistakes while the empath feels responsible for keeping everything together, the weight of the relationship on their shoulders. Alongside this imbalance grows unspoken grief, a sorrow that is never expressed. It is grief for conversations that never happened, for the words that were never spoken. Grief for appreciation that was never expressed, for the gratitude that never came. Grief for effort that was never recognized, for the sacrifices that went unnoticed. Grief for emotional safety that slowly disappeared without anyone acknowledging it, for the security that eroded over time. This grief often remains invisible because the empath continues functioning normally, going through the motions of daily life. They go to work, fulfilling their professional responsibilities. They smile politely, hiding their pain from the world. They fulfill responsibilities, meeting the expectations placed upon them. While privately carrying disappointment that nobody realizes exists, they maintain the facade of normalcy. Then one ordinary event finally arrives, one final drop that causes the overflow. It may seem small compared to everything before it, almost insignificant in isolation. Another broken promise, another careless comment, another forgotten need, another moment of emotional neglect. To everyone else, it appears like a minor issue, a small thing that should not matter. But for the empath, it becomes the final confirmation that nothing is truly changing, the evidence that their hopes were misplaced. The final event is rarely the real reason for the silence, rarely the true cause of the breakdown. It simply confirms what countless earlier experiences have already taught them, that the pattern will not change. The glass overflows not because of one moment, but because every previous moment is finally impossible to ignore, because the weight of the past has become too heavy to carry. When this point is reached, something important changes inside the empath's mind, a fundamental shift in their perception and behavior. They stop explaining themselves the way they once did, the endless conversations finally ceasing. Earlier, they believed that clearer communication could solve the problem, that if they just found the right words, understanding would follow. If they found better words, perhaps the other person would finally understand, finally see what they had been trying to say. If they explained their feelings more gently, perhaps empathy would be returned, the love they had given finally reciprocated. But repeated invalidation slowly changes the way people communicate, eroding their willingness to speak. Each unsuccessful conversation teaches the brain that expressing pain may not lead to comfort, that vulnerability may not be met with care. Instead, it may lead to dismissal, defensiveness, excuses, or complete misunderstanding, responses that leave them feeling even more alone. Over time, this creates learned emotional exhaustion, a state where the effort of speaking outweighs the potential benefit. The empath no longer lacks words, their vocabulary intact. They simply lack confidence that those words will make any difference, that they will be heard and understood. Emotional burnout replaces emotional persistence, the desire to try giving way to the need to protect. Speaking begins to feel more draining than remaining silent, more costly than staying quiet. They grow tired of repeating the same needs in different ways, tired of explaining the same pain over and over. They become afraid that opening their heart again will only produce another painful misunderstanding, another wound to add to the collection. Protecting emotional energy suddenly becomes more important than winning another conversation, than being understood. Acceptance quietly replaces persuasion, the need to convince giving way to the peace of letting go. Instead of trying to convince someone to care, they begin accepting that genuine care cannot be forced, that love cannot be demanded. This is the hidden meaning behind the phrase. They stop explaining because they stop expecting to be understood, because they have finally accepted that understanding may never come. Their silence is not designed to punish anyone, not intended to cause pain. It is a form of emotional conservation, a way to protect what little strength remains. They are saving the little emotional strength they still have instead of spending it on conversations that history has taught them are unlikely to change anything, unlikely to lead anywhere new. Yet the people around them often misunderstand the silence completely, projecting their own assumptions onto the quiet. One of the biggest misunderstandings about empaths begins after they become quiet, after the words stop flowing. The people around them often notice the silence, feel its weight, but they rarely understand what it truly means. Instead, they fill the silence with their own assumptions, their own interpretations, often based on their own fears and insecurities. Some decide the empath has become cold and no longer cares, that their love has simply vanished. Others believe they are angry and trying to punish everyone around them, using silence as a weapon. Some even think the silence is a form of manipulation, a silent game designed to make others feel guilty or desperate for attention, a a strategy to regain control. There are people who assume the empath is waiting for someone to chase them, apologize repeatedly, or beg for another chance, that they are playing hard to get. These interpretations seem believable because many people have experienced silence being used as a weapon before, have seen it employed as a tool of control. In some relationships, silence is meant to control, to create anxiety, to force another person to react, to keep them off balance. But this is where psychology reveals something important, a truth about how we perceive others. People often interpret another person's behavior through the lens of their own habits, through their own emotional patterns. This is known as projection, a psychological defense mechanism where we attribute our own feelings and motives to others. Instead of asking why another person behaves a certain way, they unconsciously imagine what their own reason would be if they acted the same way. If someone personally uses silence to express anger, they naturally assume everyone else's silence also comes from anger, because that is what silence means to them. If they stay quiet to manipulate, they assume another quiet person must be manipulating too, because that is the only reason they can imagine for silence. They project their own emotional patterns onto someone else without realizing it, assuming that others think and feel as they do. This creates one of the greatest misunderstandings between empaths and the people around them, a gap that is difficult to bridge. The empath is not trying to create confusion, not trying to punish anyone. They are not secretly hoping someone will suffer, not wishing pain on others. In many cases, they have simply stopped asking for emotional reciprocity because repeated experience has convinced them it is no longer possible, because their requests have been ignored too many times. Emotional reciprocity means both people are willing to understand, support, and value each other's emotional experiences, that the giving is mutual. Earlier in the relationship, the empath believed this balance could eventually develop, that they could create it through effort. They listened carefully, communicated honestly, forgave mistakes, and continued offering patience because they hoped those efforts would be returned one day, because they believed in the possibility of change. But after enough disappointment, that hope slowly fades, the flame dying out. They stop asking because asking has become emotionally exhausting, because every request is another opportunity for disappointment. They stop reminding because reminders no longer create change, because they have been ignored too many times. They stop explaining because every explanation feels like another conversation that ends exactly where it began, going nowhere. Their silence is not directed against another person, not aimed at anyone in particular. It is directed toward protecting themselves from repeating a cycle that has already caused too much emotional pain, from walking the same path again. Unfortunately, people who depended on the empath's endless understanding often notice this change only after it disappears, after the flow of care has stopped. Suddenly, the person who always checked in no longer sends messages, the familiar contact ceasing. The one who always solved conflicts no longer starts difficult conversations, the silence replacing the old patterns. The one who always forgave no longer reaches out after an argument, the bridge no longer being rebuilt. Those who benefited from the empath's emotional generosity sometimes mistake this withdrawal for cruelty because they had quietly become accustomed to receiving emotional support without giving the same amount in return, without recognizing the imbalance. What feels like rejection to them is often simply the empath deciding that emotional balance matters, too, that they deserve the same care they have always given. This misunderstanding grows even stronger because silence removes opportunities for explanation, for the words that could clarify. The empath is no longer trying to defend their intentions, no longer seeking to be understood. Other people are left to create their own stories, and human beings naturally prefer explanations over uncertainty, filling the gaps with whatever makes sense to them. The mind fills empty spaces with assumptions, and those assumptions are often shaped more by personal fears than by reality, by what we fear to be true rather than what is true. While everyone else is trying to guess what the silence means, trying to decode the hidden message, something much deeper is happening inside the empath that very few people ever notice, a transformation that is invisible but profound. The most important changes rarely happen on the outside, rarely announce themselves to the world. They happen quietly within the mind, in the private space where transformation takes root. Emotional detachment is not a single decision made in one dramatic moment, not a sudden shift that occurs all at once. It is usually a slow psychological process that unfolds over weeks, months, or even years, a gradual loosening of the ties that bind. At first, the empath still hopes an apology will come, still believes that understanding will eventually arrive. They believe the other person may eventually recognize the damage that has been done, may finally see the pain they have caused. They continue checking their phone with quiet hope, scanning for a message that will change everything. They replay conversations before falling asleep, imagining different outcomes. They imagine different endings where both people finally understand each other, where reconciliation is possible. The relationship continues living inside their thoughts, even when nothing changes in reality, even when the silence remains unbroken. But as time passes, the mind begins adapting, adjusting to the new reality. The empath gradually stops expecting apologies because experience has shown that waiting only creates more disappointment, that hope is not enough. They stop imagining different outcomes because imagination can no longer compete with repeated reality, with the evidence of experience. They stop rehearsing conversations that will probably never happen, that are unlikely to take place. They stop wondering what they could have said differently because they finally realize the problem was never a lack of words, never a failure of communication. They slowly begin releasing the emotional attachment that once connected them so deeply to the relationship, cutting the cords that bound them. This process is often invisible because daily life continues as normal, because the empath still functions. They still go to work, fulfilling their obligations. They meet responsibilities, doing what needs to be done. They smile politely, hiding their inner state. They participate in conversations, maintaining appearances. Yet inside, emotional ties are quietly loosening, the bonds becoming weaker with each passing day. Psychology describes part of this process as radical acceptance, a profound shift in how we relate to reality. Radical acceptance does not mean approving of painful behavior, does not mean saying that everything was fair or right. It simply means accepting reality exactly as it is, instead of exhausting yourself fighting against what cannot be changed, instead of wasting energy on denial. The empath reaches a point where they stop arguing with reality, where they accept what is rather than what they wish it to be. They stop wishing another person had become someone different, stop hoping for a transformation that is not coming. They stop expecting yesterday to be rewritten, stop longing for a past that never existed. Acceptance replaces resistance, and although this sounds peaceful, it is often one of the most emotionally difficult stages because it requires letting go of hopes that once felt essential, dreams that were central to their identity. Alongside acceptance comes the development of emotional boundaries, the creation of limits that protect the self. Earlier, the empath believed love meant unlimited emotional availability, that true care meant always being there. They answered every message, no matter the time. They solved every problem, no matter the cost. They absorbed every emotional storm, no matter the toll. And they believed endless patience was proof of genuine care, that their endurance was evidence of love. Now, they begin learning that healthy love also requires limits, that boundaries are not barriers but guidelines. Caring for another person should never require abandoning yourself, should never demand the sacrifice of your own well-being. Boundaries are not walls built to keep people out, not barriers that prevent connection. They are guidelines that protect emotional well-being, structures that allow relationships to flourish safely. For many empaths, creating boundaries feels uncomfortable at first because they fear disappointing others, because they are not used to putting themselves first. Yet, over time, they realize that without boundaries, compassion slowly becomes self-neglect. That endless giving becomes a form of self-harm. Another important part of this transformation is self-preservation, the instinct to protect oneself from harm. Earlier, protecting others always came first, the empath's safety always secondary. Now, the mind quietly asks a different question, a question that changes everything. What happens if nobody protects me? If I am always taking care of others, who will take care of me? This question changes everything, shifting the empath's perspective. The empath begins conserving emotional energy instead of spending it endlessly, treating their energy as a precious resource rather than an unlimited supply. They become more selective about where they invest time, attention, and emotional effort, choosing carefully what deserves their energy. They understand that emotional resources are limited, that they cannot give endlessly without depleting themselves. They recognize that giving everything away leaves nothing for personal healing, for their own growth and well-being. One of the most surprising truths is that this emotional detachment often happens long before the relationship officially ends, before any external change is visible. Outsiders may believe everything is still normal because conversations continue or daily routines remain unchanged, because the surface is calm. But internally, the relationship has already begun fading, the connection eroding from the inside. Emotional dependence weakens long before physical distance appears, the ties loosening while the presence remains. By the time the final goodbye arrives, much of the grieving has already happened in silence, in the private moments when no one was watching. This explains why empaths sometimes appear calm when a relationship finally ends, why they do not break down. Their healing process did not begin after separation, after the goodbye. It began while they were still trying to save the relationship, while they were still fighting for something that was already lost. Once this quiet transformation reaches completion, once the internal shift is complete, very little can reverse it because the change is no longer based on temporary emotions, on passing feelings. It is based on a completely different understanding of reality, a new perspective that cannot be undone. This is why so many people become shocked when an empath does not return emotionally, when the door does not open again. They expected time to soften everything, to heal the wounds and restore the connection. They believed a simple apology, a thoughtful message, or a brief period of kindness would restore the relationship exactly as it was before, that the old dynamic could be resurrected. Earlier in the relationship, that expectation might have been correct because empaths often forgave quickly and believed in fresh starts, because they were always willing to try again. But after emotional detachment has fully developed, returning becomes much more difficult, the door locked from the inside. The reason is not stubbornness, not a refusal to forgive. It is emotional learning, the deep lessons that experience has taught. If touching a hot surface burns your hand enough times, your brain automatically becomes cautious around heat, instinctively pulling away. Emotional experiences work in much the same way, teaching the brain what is safe and what is not. Repeated disappointment teaches the nervous system which situations feel emotionally unsafe, which people cannot be trusted. Once emotional safety has been broken repeatedly, trust no longer returns simply because someone promises things will be different, because words without action have lost their power. Emotional safety is built through consistent actions, not temporary emotions, through reliability rather than promises. This is where many people confuse forgiveness with trust, believing that one automatically includes the other. Forgiveness is an internal decision to release resentment, so that pain no longer controls your life, to free yourself from the burden of anger. Trust is completely different, a separate process that requires different conditions. Trust must be rebuilt slowly through repeated evidence that change is real and lasting, through consistent behavior over time. An empath may sincerely forgive someone who caused deep emotional pain, releasing the anger and resentment. They may no longer feel anger, no longer wish for revenge. They may genuinely hope that person finds happiness and grows into someone healthier, wishing them well. But forgiveness does not erase memory, does not wipe the slate clean. The mind still remembers every pattern that created suffering, every betrayal, every broken promise, every moment of neglect. The heart remembers every lonely conversation, every moment of feeling invisible, every time their needs were dismissed. Those memories become part of emotional learning, making blind trust almost impossible, because the brain has learned to be cautious. This is why people often say, "I thought everything was fine because they forgave me." They mistake forgiveness for emotional closeness, assuming that forgiveness means reconciliation. Yet closeness depends on safety, on the feeling of being secure. And safety cannot exist where repeated pain has destroyed confidence, where trust has been broken too many times. The empath is no longer emotionally dependent on receiving understanding from the same person, no longer needs their approval. They have learned to create emotional stability within themselves instead of waiting for someone else to provide it, to find safety within rather than without. That quiet independence surprises people because they remember the empath who once fought so hard to keep the relationship alive, who gave so much of themselves. They fail to realize that the person standing before them has been changed by every painful experience that came before, that they are not the same person they once were. The silence did not create this transformation, did not cause the change. It simply revealed it, made visible what was already there. When viewed from the outside, silence appears empty, a void where words used to be. But inside an empath, silence often contains years of emotional growth, painful lessons, difficult acceptance, and the quiet decision to choose peace instead of endless struggle to choose themselves. It is not revenge, because revenge still depends on another person's reaction, is still focused on the other. It is not manipulation, because manipulation seeks control, while the empath has already released the desire to control anyone, has let go of the need to manage outcomes. It is not emotional weakness, because choosing peace after repeated disappointment requires tremendous emotional strength, requires courage and resilience. The silence represents acceptance of reality instead of endless resistance, a surrender to what is. It reflects emotional maturity, because the empath understands that not every relationship can be healed through love alone, that some wounds are too deep. It becomes an act of self-protection, because continuing the same emotional cycle would only deepen the wounds that already exist, would only cause more pain. Most importantly, it marks the end of chasing understanding from people who repeatedly refuse to offer it, the end of a futile pursuit. The empath finally realizes that constantly explaining themselves cannot force another person to listen with genuine empathy, cannot create understanding where there is no willingness. Some lessons can only be learned through distance, only through the silence that allows clarity to emerge. Some relationships end emotionally long before anyone speaks the final words, before any official goodbye. In many cases, the loudest goodbye is the one that is never spoken, because every conversation that once seemed necessary has quietly lost its purpose, has become irrelevant. The silence is no longer waiting for an answer. It has already found one, has already reached its conclusion. Every journey we explored today leads back to one powerful truth, a truth that transforms everything. An empath's silence is almost never the beginning of the story, never the start of something new. It is usually the ending of countless invisible battles that no one else ever noticed, the final chapter of a long and difficult struggle. We have seen why empaths absorb emotions more deeply than most people, why their sensitivity is both a gift and a burden. We have seen why they spend so much time trying to understand instead of judging, why their first instinct is compassion. We have seen why they continue giving second chances even when they are hurting, why their hope persists beyond all reason. And we have seen why emotional pain rarely arrives all at once, why it builds slowly through repeated disappointment, broken trust, and the feeling of carrying relationships alone. By the time an empath becomes quiet, they have often spent months or even years trying to protect a connection that was quietly falling apart, fighting a battle that was already lost. Their silence is not born from anger, not from a desire to punish. It is born from acceptance, from a deep surrender to reality. It is the moment they stop using their energy to convince someone to care and begin using that same energy to heal themselves, to care for their own wounded heart. That is why silence can become one of the strongest forms of emotional growth, a catalyst for profound change. It is not about giving up on people, about abandoning love. It is about refusing to give up on yourself, about choosing your own well-being. Perhaps the greatest misunderstanding is believing that silence means nothing is happening, that it is empty and meaningless. In reality, some of the biggest psychological transformations happen without a single word being spoken, in the quiet spaces between thoughts. The empath who once explained every feeling now learns that peace does not always require another conversation, that silence can be its own resolution. The person who once carried everyone else's emotions begins carrying their own heart with the same kindness they once gave so freely to others, turning their compassion inward. This is where real healing begins, the true transformation. Not when another person finally understands them, but when they no longer depend on that understanding to move forward, when they find their own validation. Sometimes the quietest person in the room has already fought the longest battle inside their own heart, has already won the most important war. Their silence is not empty, not a void. It is filled with every conversation they no longer need to have, every expectation they have finally released, and every lesson that taught them the value of protecting their own peace. If this journey changed the way you think about empathy, silence, and emotional healing, then there is still so much more to discover, so many more layers to explore. The human mind is full of hidden patterns that quietly shape our relationships, our choices, and the people we become, patterns that influence our lives without our awareness. The next step in understanding these patterns may completely change the way you see yourself and the people around you, opening doors you never knew existed. So, don't stop here. Don't end the journey. Continue exploring with us, because there is always more to learn. If you enjoyed this video, take a moment to like it, because your support helps these ideas reach more people who may need them, who are searching for the same insights. Share this video with someone who would understand its message or benefit from hearing it, someone who is walking a similar path. And if you are fascinated by psychology, relationships, emotional intelligence, and the hidden forces that influence human behavior, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and never underestimate the quiet strength that can change a life from within. The silence you hear is not the end. It is often the beginning of something far more powerful than words could ever express.